Hi, and welcome to today's webinar with Fortinet in Order, not your average fireside chat, breaking down the barriers of traditional cybersecurity. As a bit of housekeeping before we get started, all participant lines have been muted. Please enter your questions into the chat function. We will do our best to address all questions during the Q&A portion at the end of today's presentation. If we run out of time, we will follow up with you via email. As we dive in today, I want to go ahead and take the opportunity to introduce our two presenters. We have Jeff and Jonathan joining us today. Jeff is the current CSO at Order, where he's responsible for security direction, both within Order products and internal security. Prior to Order, Jeff was the VP of Information Security for Optiv, where he was responsible for all cybersecurity operations, governance, risk and compliance, endpoint, internal incident response, physical security, and employee security awareness groups. Before Optiv, Jeff was the Senior Director of Information Security for SpaceX, where he was responsible for overall security strategy of SpaceX and managing the information security, compliance, security operations, and physical security groups. Jeff has also served as the VP and R&D and Chief Architect for Occupant Labs, the Director of Threat Intelligence and Research at WebRoot Security and Software, and a vulnerability researcher at Internet Security Systems. Jeff is also well known for his insight and interview and for numerous news channels and publications, speaking roles at various security conferences, as well as authoring several vulnerability disclosures and patents. Jonathan was recognized as one of the top 75 cybersecurity thought leaders in 2019. He is the head of Global Security Advisory Team and executive lead for strategy and analytics at Fortinet. With his extensive experience in security and business continuity, Jonathan's work at Fortinet is focused on strategy, data analytics, and helping enterprises with digital transformation for security from the IoT edge across enterprise networks to hybrid clouds. Previously, he served as the security CTO at Verizon Global Security Services, where he was responsible for the strategic technology partnerships, the Verizon Cyber Intelligence Center, and the data science team that produces the annual Verizon DBIR. He has also led analytics-driven transformations for the Verizon MSS platform to support nation-state grade continuous monitoring and served as the Verizon lead for global security evangelism and as the head of product management. Before joining Verizon, he served as the U.S. Foreign Service and is widely published as a security expert and frequent speaker at industry events with unique global commercial and public sector experience, as well as a deep understanding of threats, technology, compliance, and business issues, and currently holds patents for IoT security. Thank you both for joining us today. As we dive in today, I think I'm going to go ahead and prompt you guys with a fairly easy question for both of you, which is, as we delve into this conversation, I'll go to Jeff first. How have you seen the responsibilities for security management grow or evolve in your tenure?
Yeah, I guess, how I've seen it grow is probably in just not only the language that's used, but also just the responsibility spread over, different groups and different organizations within a company. So I think this slide, speaks to it in terms of, obviously you have executive responsibility in the way of course, the CISO, CIO, CEO, CFO, but also, when you're talking to, IT or governance, risk and compliance, or even procurement and facilities, all of these organizations, over the last, the 22 years that I've been doing security, these companies have really these organizations have been really pulled into security to kind of speak the language. And I think that's a byproduct of security being integral into organizational trust. And when you're talking to things like vendors or partners, or of course, customers, everybody kind of needs to start speaking the same language. And so, it goes down from, just, two people in HR saying, hey, do you use multi-factor authentication within your network, all the way up to, governance, risk compliance, and third-party risk management, and having the CISO answer. So what do you think, Jonathan? What have you seen?
Yeah, it's funny because as you answered that, I was thinking back across the time I started, and is marked by things like the TCP/IP handshake, right?
Right.
And that goes back to when I first got involved in security. It was basically a firewall, and and responsibility was left on the shoulders of maybe one or two people. And over the last 25 odd years, what I've seen is that it became an industry. It became a discipline with certifications, with an MOS in the military. There are degrees in what we call cybersecurity now. So it's much more formalized, much more disciplined, much more structured, and that gives you a certain level of predictability. At the same time, I've seen the responsibility morph to being, it's a shared responsibility model. I mean, shared from everyone on that slide, right? Certainly at the executive level, but progressively cascading downwards through line managers and employees. And now we're at a point where we have security awareness training. So it's literally everyone's responsibility. But paradoxically, as we go into a shared responsibility model and we start thinking about how we're shifting IT and morphing into cloud and edge-based computing, and we're using much more third-party services, whether they're service providers, they're vendors. It's a much more disaggregated and distributed model where responsibility may be shared amongst all the stakeholders, internal and external, but accountability still falls within the area of now the executive leadership team and the CSO and the CISO and his or her team. But in many ways, it's still pretty lonely at the top, because when something, quote, bad happens, everyone looks at the CSO or the CISO. But I think increasingly at the board level, there's recognition that they have skin in the game as well. And the responsibilities have really evolved as the object of the exercise has evolved. We first started off with compliance, whether that was PCI compliance or HIPAA compliance, or FISMA compliance. And then somewhere along the way, I think it was probably the late 90s and then progressively into the mid 2000s that we realized that being compliant wasn't necessarily secure. And then responsibility shifted towards risk management, and now it's a reasonable level of care. So yeah, a lot has changed in that time. Everything has gotten more complex. I always like to look back and forward and think about what remains constant. And this takes us back in time, but we still have confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data, and that resonates just as much today as it did when I first got going. Yeah. So those things don't change.
I like that you brought up the TCP handshake, and for some reason that made me think of I guess one of my styles that I've done throughout my career is implicitly trust, but then verify, right? And similar to SYN, ACK, in a way where it's like, I think that's caused things to start merging into that security is kind of everyone's responsibility, because they have to speak some sort of security language. And I think that obviously breaches have kind of brought that to the forefront from an executive perspective, and then obviously come down on different organizational groups. But in that trust but verify model, working in incident response, I had so many companies that even when they were onboarding me from an incident perspective, they were still kind of feeding me these taglines and half truths, in the way where the CISO is like, oh yeah, no, absolutely, we take patches every Patch Tuesday. Our AV is updated every hour, right? And then you get in there and you're like, you don't even know what, you've got 30% of the stuff on your network you don't even have in your inventory system. But it's really funny watching organizations like that mature.
Yeah.
And just come to grips with not necessarily lying, but being real, or when they're kind of discussing risk.
Yeah.
And being able to do things right, like having the time to do something right is better than having time to do it twice.
Yeah.
Kind of incorrectly. And so that's the thing where that I feel that trust but verify models, particularly from third-party risk management perspectives, kind of really calls on getting education to your employees and to your organization, right? Making sure that everyone's on the same page, because it's so much easier to essentially tell the truth, versus having different versions of the story coming out of different, different organizational structures within your organization or within your company.
That's a great comment, because I remember in the early days, we didn't want to tell the leadership that there were holes, that there were vulnerabilities, that we really didn't know what was on the network or who was accessing it, because that's bad news. That says that we're failing in our jobs. But I think over the last 20 odd years now, there is a realization generally that the breach is almost inevitable,
Hmm.
and that nothing is perfect. And now executive teams expect you to report that, yeah, there are vulnerabilities, but here is a plan on how we address that. Here's how we prioritize that patching. There are areas of the network that we don't have complete visibility into, but here's how we're addressing that. And I think we've gone from that sort of binary, yes, we're secure, we're not secure, you're hired, you're fired, to sort of a red light, yellow light, green light, right? So what is our desired end state? What's our current state? And what is our plan to get to that desired state? And are those steps and are those plans reasonable? And I think that's a huge, huge shift. And it changes the way we look at security, but it also changes the types of pressures that we're on. There's so many things over the last 20 years have changed with regards to responsibilities, but now I think more than ever, CISOs and CISOs and security professionals almost have a professional responsibility that's beyond the company that they work in. That we have a professional requirement, if you will, that says we will not speak untruths. That if there is something glaring, we will memorialize it. We will disclose it. We cannot just cover it up and move on. There's, I think within the industry as a whole, there's a discipline, there's certifications, there's a body of work that says, we all literally raise our right hand and take this oath that we're security professionals, and that in many ways our first responsibility is the brand that we secure. But beyond that, we also have to think about the greater good of the society, the economy, et cetera, right? So I think that's very, very different than where we started 20 years ago. Yeah.
I totally agree. I've also seen just that you're talking about executive communication and the fear of communicating risk, right, in a realistic way. I definitely saw that throughout my career, and ultimately, I think it hurt a lot of organizations.
Yeah.
Particularly like when I would work on breaches, it was, and I think it still is to some extent, a kind of a convenient straw man that CISOs build, in the sense of like, okay, well, you have, in the threat landscape, you have nation state actors with 0-day vulnerabilities that cost millions of dollars to acquire in R&D, and that's what we're faced with, right? Well, yes, that's true, but oftentimes it's just an oversight, right? It's hey, we're not patching, just some of the normal blocking and tackling
Yep.
things. And it was, from a communication of a risk perspective, it was always that thing that CISOs could fall back on, where it's like, hey, it's just little old me versus the PLA, right? The entire, Chinese and Russian military are just after little old me. And you're like, hey, is that true? And oftentimes, it really wasn't. They weren't really the target. And it was, probably some kid in Starbucks that just launched a, ransomware campaign on them.
Yeah.
So it's,
Yeah, I think your background and mine span pretty similar tracks, and when you're going through pen testing and red teaming, and one of the insights I gained was that like the adversary always works from the perspective of what's actually there.
mhm,
What's actually in the system, its real state, how it's configured or misconfigured.
right.
Whereas the defender, the white hats, typically work with the presumption of what they believe to be there.
Mhm.
And often the case, that's not not the real situation. And I've seen situations where threat actors will leave a network diagram behind as an artifact to say, hey, by the way, thanks very much, but you really should do a better job at this as just an IT person.
Right.
Letting this is what your network really looks like. These are the holes that we exploited. These are the misconfigurations that we exploited. This is what we did. And so many cases, I think that we have to take that perspective of that it's not a hermetically sealed environment.
Right.
And that as you said, we're going to talk about trust, I imagine, but trust needs to be continually assessed, and that controls and technologies are just like peas and carrots. They're perishable.
Yeah, for
And you
sure.
really have to do a very diligent process of regular assessments about where am I? What does my actual current state really look at? And what's the deviation from the norm? And expect to find holes in that state. And so, yeah, I think that's why the responsibility model has also shifted towards governance, and that you literally have people watching other roles. So you may have the GRC team watching the security team. You may have an external auditor watching all of that. And then you may have the underwriter for the cyber insurance policy also watching the entire team, because there are so many gaps that may appear. Visibility has been very hard. And I think that ties in the responsibilities as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it is one of the things at least in my career, from a security management perspective, I, immediately saw the value in legal. It was one of those things where, like, from a, collaboration perspective,
Yeah.
obviously I was, always attached with IT and the CIO, and, that then migrated into, hey, onboarding, offboarding, HR for sure. So, like, let me bring in the HR organization into this, from onboarding, offboarding, education, right? Security awareness training, but then also facilities. And it was one of those things when I saw, IT procurement was servers, workstations, laptops, those types of things. But then, the facilities teams were bringing in devices into my network, like televisions, right? And
Yeah.
televisions have been in boardrooms since, the late 70s, I think. And they just kind of got switched out from CRTs to plasmas to LCDs to OLEDs. And through that kind of graduation or evolution, they've turned into computers.
Yeah.
These things have, two wireless radios on them, Bluetooth. They can communicate over IR, and they've got usually an Ethernet jack on the bottom of them, or at least a Chromecast or some sort of device that's plugged into them so they can stream content. And yeah, tying into facilities in order to make sure that, hey, are we buying a secure device? Or are we even buying a device that's basically a computer, in and of itself? But ultimately legal, particularly when I was doing international expansion, having to communicate things where it's like, hey, we're trying to sell a device that has encryption in it, so we're having to adhere to things like Wassenaar. Those things were always just kind of out of my realm, and then kind of slowly started getting brought in, at least from a vocabulary perspective, down to like risk and security frameworks.
Yeah, this collaboration across IT, legal, and the other areas of the business are very critical right now, especially when it comes to reasonable care. When I first started reading about that shift in security from compliance to risk management, I got that made sense. We're here to identify and manage risk. In fact, if you look at GDPR, you look at the California Consumer Privacy Act, you look at the New York State Financial Regulations Part 500, you look at things like NIST CSF, you find specifically a term of art that says a reasonable level of care in the identification and management of risk. That's the object of the exercise today. And that was the findings both in civil and criminal law after some major data breaches. So the first thing I did was try to find my general counsel and say, what does reasonable care mean? and he said, look, Jonathan, it's English common law. It basically says that what would a reasonable person do knowing what he or she knows at that time? And were those steps reasonable? And I said, well, that doesn't sound very prescriptive. He said, it's not. There is no prescriptive definition. It's one of those things where you have to be able to defend that, right? It's a highly subjective set of prescriptive conditions, but you've got to decide, is it reasonable to not know whether your firewalls are properly configured? Is it reasonable not to do a regular series of pen tests to understand what your environment is? Is it reasonable not to have a third party audit that demonstrates the fact that you've implemented the standards as you've adopted, right? Is it reasonable not to use best in class certified products? Should you go with a product that's gone through common criteria, is certified by the US Defense Department for commercial products, in classified environments? Or should you go with a no-name startup company that says it can do all these things but has no certifications, right? Those are, I say that, but those things I see continually across the data breaches that I've investigated and researched, right? They're those types of gaps. Secondarily, as you said earlier, our businesses now are far more IP enabled than ever before. You talked about it, about that IP enabled TV. I remember many a red team exercise where I was dressed up as a technician
Right.
and I would wheel in a TV into that conference room. No one would say a thing. And for the next, week or 10 days, whenever that soaking period was in, you could literally record everything that was said in that conference room. And it really was an eye opener for the client, right? But it speaks to the fact that we are in what the military would call a very prepared battlefield, that everything is IP connected, it's interconnected, and therefore can be exploited. So understanding, as you mentioned earlier from HR, your offboarding, making sure that the people who have offboarded the business, that their IP access, their access to their networks have been disabled. But in addition to that, their conference call passwords and credentials have been disabled.
Right.
How many, I've done this, I've gone back in previous employments, and a year or 2 years later, I've gone back and found out that my conference bridge was still readily available and that my credentials were still applicable. There are just so many cases, and those things lead to vulnerabilities. So it's absolutely critical to understand all of the dependencies, interconnections across that ecosystem inside that business, from HR, from IT, from legal, from the physical plant itself, but increasingly on that edge. We have more edge computing that's about to emerge over the next 3 to 5 years than ever before. In fact, Gartner has said that the vast majority, 50+% of all new computing and data generated will not be in clouds or traditional data centers, but it's going to be on those edges, those smart factory floors, the interconnected the vehicle fleets, the smart solutions, the disconnected commerce models. All of these things are going to be IP enabled, and they're going to have entities, IoT devices, that are collecting and sharing information, and they're going to make in some cases, fully autonomous decisions, right? So as we move towards predictive and proactive business processes, leveraging the internet connections, that collaboration is going to be key to identifying. In fact, when we go through segmentation exercises or zero trust planning, the hardest thing is getting all of these stakeholders to a table and identifying the business processes that they own, right? And identifying the underlying dependencies. So this slide really, really hits to the core of it, is that you may have the best controls, you may have the best technology, but if you haven't defined the data flows, the classified the data in terms of its criticality, its location, its owners, and to understand the underlying business process, it really begins to jeopardize your success.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I like that you brought up obviously the edge computing, and I think that is definitely a rapid change, one of those changes that we're seeing right now, and one of the worries that I have is that sometimes the standards and policies and even the regulatory bodies, they're kind of slow to catch up to that.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And so I think it's one of those things that we also, just change the way organizations work, during this pandemic, right? We, almost overnight had to onboard a completely remote workforce, at least for several industries.
Mm-hmm.
And you started to see these, obviously, hey, we need to facilitate these remote employees by setting up, these systems immediately, like VPNs, any sort of like remote management tools, access. But now you're seeing that mature, and I'm starting to see that kind of mature faster than policy standards and these regulatory bodies are really.
And the reason why it's maturing faster is because we're now working with millennial expectations, right? So every interaction with that brand, we expect to be wowed continuously. We want to have better experiences, right? We want very low jitter, very low latency, high network performance, a high level of security, right? A level of security and privacy assurance as well. We want it at a low cost, and then increasingly want highly personalized and customizable capabilities. In order to do that, you've got to have tight collaboration across HR, marketing, IT, and legal, right? Because the board wants accelerated time to market, greater agility, greater innovation, and your stakeholders all want that too. but they also want it with really seamless security all in the background. And so I think the pandemic accelerated that. But
Mhm.
we all now have this expectation that work is something we do rather than a place we commute to and from, and that we're going to have a pretty distributed and very disaggregated enterprise IT environment moving forward. And I don't think that genie's ever going to get back in the bottle.
No.
No.
I don't think so either. Particularly with, I would, going pivoting back to standards and policies
Yeah.
where they have, almost prescribed,
Yeah.
on premise only, like, yeah, absolutely air gapped. You have to
Yeah.
be in the war room with the key and a button and another person next to you.
Yeah.
And yeah, that genie is not going back in the
And
bottle.
that's a great point, because you're really talking about the difference between OT and IT.
Yep.
OT standards, best practices are pretty prescriptive, as you said. They said this shall only be in an air-gapped environment. You will have extraordinarily limited access, whitelisting. You will apply zero trust.
Mhm.
IT systems, when you look at those standards I spoke to, GDPR, CCA, NIST, CSF, they're not prescriptive. They describe, right? They describe what you should be doing, but they leave it up to you to do that. And I think, culturally speaking, that's one of the issues that we have to address here. So this is a great slide, because it outlines almost organizational and cultural differences between IT and OT. Forget just the technology itself, right? But
Right.
the mindset of these two teams are being merged right now, because accelerated time to market, because of those enhanced experiences and business demands, right? And so, yeah, it reshapes those security assumptions. And now you've got to have systems and controls that can span both. And there's no way around that. What are your thoughts right now about how should an IT team, begin that integration so that they can have visibility into the OT environment?
You know, this slide kind of communicates the Purdue model,
Yeah,
in
yeah,
a way where we're starting to see things that, like SCADA ICS systems that were traditionally air gap kind of being up leveled to, obviously Ethernet,
yeah,
IP, TCP IP, kind of communications, and that just kind of brings it into like, okay, well now I don't have to be in the same room with this thing. I could be anywhere in the country as long as kind of a remote management system is put in place. But from a security perspective, that just immediately to me means that I now have an increased attack surface,
yeah,
right? And obviously, like going back to what I said before in terms of threat actors that are nation states or have 0-day vulnerabilities that they could potentially burn. I would look at that as table stakes for the rest of my life, in the sense of, okay, well, I've got to look at the attack surface for these certain things. And particularly with OT devices, you kind of have that convenient mechanism to communicate risk that these things could kill people,
oh yeah,
right? It's one thing to say, hey, I have got a server up here that's inherently vulnerable. It's another thing to say that I've got a robot with an X-ray device in order to scan for fissures inside of a nose cone for a rocket ship that could literally kill somebody if something went wrong. So being able to obviously communicate that risk through threat models, I think, is going to be incredibly important. But I also think just that OT to IT convergence is really going to cause an education for security teams. Just
yeah,
because I think security and CISOs have been traditionally IT focused, and OT has been so separated from the conversation
yeah,
that you're going to get you're going to have to have this immediate education session with many CISOs where they're starting
yeah.
to learn things like common SCADA ICS systems, right? What the attack surface of those things are, in order to bring them into realistic threat models, in order to be able to find the risks and communicate them accurately.
Yeah, I mean, IT gives you a certain allowance of downtime,
Right.
non-availability. OT really doesn't. OT, because as you said, those life and limb issues are pretty critical. So I'm thinking that, you're going to have tremendous visibility to really understand when any of that OT environment demonstrates anomalous behavior, because that anomalous behavior just can't be tolerated. The tolerances are much tighter in OT, to put it in that vernacular. And I think IT teams are going to struggle with that. But because those tolerances are so tight, because you cannot deviate from norm because of the safety issues and the operational issues, we get to the point where I think adding AI into your visibility begins to get you to that point where you get to predictive and proactive maintenance, right? Whenever I speak with OT professionals in the manufacturing environment, they're always saying, look, the object of the exercise is to layer automation and AI so that we can begin that proactive predictive step, because what you're trying to generate are incremental improvements in business process intervals, right? So those intervals, as they improve, will generally improve productivity, improve safety and operational issues as well. And I think that's where they can benefit from the IT environment, because those tools now exist on the IT side. And that's what we do at Fortinet, is that we provide that fabric, right? That provides the overview between the OT and the IT environment. But I think that this issue is much underappreciated, as you alluded to, especially as we go through edge compute. I think that's going to be highlighted over the next 18 months, actually.
Right. And one of the things you brought up, AI, one of the things that I definitely agree with you there, right? Like that sometimes the attack surface is so big that you're going to need something that, can obviously monitor both from a signature and from a behavioral perspective. And particularly with these OT devices that have, let's just say that it has a knob, right, with an integer that goes from, 0 to 255, but the normal operational baseline just has it hovering between 10 and 15. AI is one of those, perfect tools that you could use to say, hey, now I have a behavioral anomaly because that thing that usually exists between an integer of 10 to 15 now just went up to 200, and I've never seen that before, right? And that's I guess kind of an easy example, for the application of AI and
because you've got to categorize all of those OT systems. Is it a valve? Is it a thermostat? Is it a conveyor belt? Is it within the connected vehicle itself? There are a lot of systems as well, but one of the things I try to utilize is this example of where we're moving in level 5 fully autonomous vehicles. So we're going to go from vehicles and systems being connected via telemetry to being networked together. And so when you've got two trucks going down a highway at 90 miles an hour per se, and you're trying to find the optimal separation distance to keep everybody moving, the amount of data that's being networked between vehicles and the speed at which it's being transmitted, curated, correlated, actuated are so high, and the tolerances are so small that you really do need AI to process that type of data. And I think if you want to see what the future looks like over the next 3 to 5 years, think about the sheer volume of data that's going to be transmitted, stored, decrypted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it has to be done at near real time, which is 5G speed. And I think that's when you begin seeing the challenge ahead in terms of the OT environment.
Yeah, I from an example perspective of OT kind of growing out of the standards and regulatory bodies. You mentioned in terms of like total isolation, right? I immediately think of something like NERC, right?
Yeah.
From a regulatory body for energy. But then I also think of, during the Super Bowl, there was that small municipal water supply in Oldsmar, Florida, right? And it was, hey, this municipality is working within the small confines of its budget. It didn't have a security person, right? They're dealing with a pandemic, and in order to deal with that pandemic, they had a remote desktop machine on the edge, right? That didn't have brute forcing protection. It had a weak password, and it was connected to a SCADA interface in order to manage the the water supply. And the interesting thing there was not that it got hacked, because obviously this stuff happens. Sometimes you're one Shodan IO search query away from finding something like this on the internet accidentally. But at the same time, that IT, that operator saying, oh, well, this isn't the first time that this happened. Sometimes we'll just see the mouse start moving and we're like, oh yeah, we got to close down that system and change the password. And,
Wow.
you're starting to see that, right? Where it's like, hey, we might be accepting too much risk because we don't know, right? We haven't classified it correctly. We haven't communicated it properly. If we could say we were a one SolarWinds 123 password away from a full meltdown, I think that risk properly communicated would potentially get extra funds in order to cover that gap. But it is one of those things that particularly with like NERC, right? I don't think it's been updated for the last 6 years.
Yeah.
Right. And you're starting to get these things where it's like, hey, we need stuff right now that is focused on how organizations are protecting, and with new technology, how they're protecting their environment today.
So I think that runs into a perennial challenge, which is that the technology, the operating environment, and the threat environment always outpace the regulatory environment.
Mm-hmm.
And so as a CSO, as a CISO, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. You're damned if you fall out of compliance, and if you're in compliance, in many ways you're still vulnerable because the compliance requirements are out of date.
Right.
So in many ways, I think responsibility shifts back to, it's a very human thing that each of us then have to say, yes, I think compliance and standards are a good baseline. It demonstrates that you've achieved a certain level of rigor and discipline and commitment towards identifying and managing risk. But it's incumbent upon us in the field to know our environments and to be a little proactive in that way. So just because it's not in the compliance requirement doesn't mean it should not be attended to. I think that's one of those things that I learned in my experience, is that compliance doesn't necessarily mean secure,
Mm-hmm.
but a reasonable level of security, I'll take that over non-compliance any given day of the week. I think some of the most instructional things that shaped the way I look at security and OT, just for the people watching this, look up the largest non-nuclear detonation in human history, and you're going to find it was a Russian pipeline over in Siberia that had a overpressure valve that didn't function. I'll leave it at that. And that led to that catastrophic explosion. In fact, it was picked up in low Earth orbit satellite, and they thought it was a nuclear detonation, but it wasn't. It was an act of, I believe it's recorded as sabotage. But it's indicative of the types of dependencies you really need to look at, is that your adversaries read the same playbooks as you do. So your adversaries read the same guidelines, compliance guidelines that you're looking at. And so they know what you're trying to do. Your smart adversaries, especially your tier one, organized crime and nation states, are always going to go outside the book. Just because you do it by the book, the adversary reads the same book. That's one of the things that a very, very good APT told me. He said, Jonathan, we work with the perspective that you think what's in your network is checked off against the book. Well, we read the same book you read and the same book you measure against, and then we go outside of that book, and then we develop techniques, tactics, and procedures to address vulnerabilities that you may have overlooked. So yeah, I think standards are great. Many ways they lag behind time. They give us, like certifications, a baseline to demonstrate that there is a rigor, there's a discipline to what we do. But I would also say, look, from my time at Verizon, there was the research that suggested that 80% of the data breaches could have been mitigated through simple to intermediate controls, still valid today. Right. The remaining 20%, I would humbly suggest, are people reading outside the compliance requirements, outside this framework. They're developing techniques, tactics, and procedures, and utilizing technologies in creative ways, as evidenced by two things: that the latest breaches that are caused by that well-known supply chain issue, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, very innovative approaches. I guarantee you, the attackers there had done the reconnaissance, but they'd also done reconnaissance in terms of the compliance guidelines and the certification guidelines for that vendor. Absolutely, they did that as part of their recon effort. Secondarily, though, when you look at the paradox of how that particular attack was detected, it went back to detecting anomalous behavior and privileged access logins, right? So I would say, yeah, absolutely, they're important. But my countermeasures and controls will always be based upon looking at basics. In fact, when I looked at my time at Verizon and my time at Fortinet, there are things that we see in breaches that are 100%. You cannot change them. It's always anomalous behavior. It's always some abuse of credentials. It's always some abuse or compromise of access privileges. And those things can't be hidden. So there was the leading advanced persistent threat actor for the United States once said that, look, you should hunt your sysadmins, Jonathan, because that's who we hunt, right? So I would say guidelines, frameworks, compliance, all the legislation, extraordinarily important. And they demonstrate part of that effort about a reasonable level of care. I would say that going beyond that to demonstrate, that you have established a very reasonable approach. I said, look, I've implemented the best standards, compliance, controls, technologies, third-party attestations, et cetera. But in addition to that, I've invested in some ways so that I can detect anomalous behavior, detect some of those ways that may not be in those guidelines per se.
For sure. And I like that you mentioned, like obviously the adversaries are reading the same guidelines and standards and books. And I feel that we probably came up around the same time from a security perspective, or at least
Yeah.
infatuated. And I mean, I had the computer security criteria DoD standards book when I was 16 years old, right? I had like the NSA trusted networks book that you could go grab. I mean, those were the things that, kind of, I would say it's kind of a tale as old as time, right? If you're going to figure out how to break into a network, figure out how people are securing it at kind of the lowest common denominator, right?
Yeah.
And
right.
And compliance. I mean, I feel like you said, it's a, it's kind of table stakes, right? It's not, it doesn't mean that you're secure, right? I imagine that, every or most security companies or most companies in general that have been breached, at least in the last, let's say 24 months, I bet all of them had, some sort of PCI DSS, SOC 2, high trust, those types of things. Yet, those types of things are allowing either, exceptions, right? In a way of like, hey, here's an RDP server that's on the edge, right? That's allowing you to get ransomware, or, a bad password policy. And, those things, I thought about that SolarWinds breach from a supply chain perspective, and obviously it was kind of like something that had been discussed in the security community for years, right? And it's one of those like, okay, well, worst case supply chain attack scenarios, and you're right, it was detected by anomalous behavior through multi-factor authentication.
But think about that vendor and all of the certifications that they went through, because they were a vendor to not only the private sector and the Fortune 2000, but to public sector, federal agencies, DoD, commerce, right? So it really demonstrates that, your adversaries read the same playbook. I take no credit in that, because it was a very, very good forensic investigator that clued me into that. He said, Jonathan, have you ever noticed that the best red teamers are the ones who built networks, right? Because they read the same playbooks. They're the architects. They get it, right? And so if you're an adversary, you're looking at an architecture. Oh, I know that architecture. I know exactly where the holes most likely are. This is how I would attack it, right? So I would say, be mindful of regulations and standards. They're good frameworks as baselines, but the adversaries read the same playbooks.
The thing that worries me though is that I feel that we still have a systemic problem in security. I think that attack kind of highlights it perfectly in a way where, at first it was like the most sophisticated, it's got to be the most sophisticated nation state actor in the planet. And then, slowly it starts leaking out that, it's an intern with a bad password. And it's like, kind of going back to our original conversation where, I used to work in offensive security for a while, and so did you from a pen testing red team perspective. But why burn $1 million O-Day when you literally have a bad password that's available on the end? And the systemic problem I feel that we have is that that anomaly was detected by arguably one of the best cybersecurity companies on the planet.
Yeah.
And obviously, what tools do they have that other people don't have or other organizations haven't deployed? And still, that attack allowed for, low end 18,000 organizations, high
Yeah.
end 33 to 35,000
Mhm.
communicating to C2 networks for 8 months before it
Yeah.
was detected. And that kind of just scares me in a way where you do have this attack that happened from a supply chain perspective. You do have it living for 8 months undetected and then suddenly detected through an anomaly from a very, highly qualified security organization. But backing into that from a compliance and regulatory perspective, how do you
I think it's
build
all come down to liability and reasonable care. All of these organizations demonstrated reasonable care. I don't know if it was reasonable per the intern. I'll let the public decide that. I can't comment on that. But that's going to be a question. If you look at the biggest breaches, and when you get down to root cause analysis, was it a server whose digital certificate had expired? Was it a misconfigured firewall? What exactly allowed this to happen, and was it reasonable for that that organization to not have either controls or compensating controls in place? And it's hard as a CISO because on the one hand you're the victim. In our industry is kind of a paradox. There's a 100% expectation that you're going to fail, right? But at the same time, there's a 100% expectation that you're going to deliver at the same time. And I think that's the type of pressures that we all face. But it goes back to a word, and the word is persistence. Your adversary is going to try to establish persistence, and from there, understand your environment and where they can exploit. On the defensive side, it's about the same thing. You have got to establish persistence. And because it's through persistence that you can detect anomalous behavior. Once you detect that anomalous behavior, the 3% of things that are quote esoteric, right? So yeah, absolutely. But man, we're running short on time. I love this conversation. I feel like it's RSA time, and you and I should be sitting at a bar somewhere having drinks with a whole bunch of people discussing these things.
Absolutely. When you brought up autonomous vehicles, I was like, I've got 45 minutes on trolley experiments and Asimov to talk to you about. So
yeah, we'll do that because I one of the things I worked on a lot was autonomous vehicles, and when I found out that our FortiGate next generation firewalls are on everything from ships and planes and satellites and those types of things is really quite thrilling. But I, for one, am loving the day when these autonomous vehicles become a reality. So, hey, Jeff, thanks for this time. It's been awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. It's been a good discussion.
Thank you both so much for your time, and thank you for those that joined today. We will be following up with the recording of this webinar as well as some additional pieces of collateral just that have direct relation to Jonathan and Jeff's conversation today. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.